Hello, everyone out there. This is the Patriot Show. My name is Anthony Stephen Malone. I am your host. This is part 2 of the Stephen Apatow interview. He is a very experienced gentleman. If you haven't seen part 1, you can still get a lot of benefits out of this part 2 interview. Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Good, Anthony.
Good man. It's good to have you back on the show again. I was a little bit inundated with personal messages and emails from people within the military intelligence community and the government community that were asking questions and things, which I'm going to forward all them on to you as well. Now, excellent. Following on from our part 1 interview, we would like to jump straight back into it. And I want to gain as much from yourself and your experience from my viewers as well. Can we go straight into H2? Can you explain this and give us some background on it?
Absolutely. H2 is really an acronym for the Humanitarian Intervention Initiative. It was an effort that I put forward that essentially encompassed non-lethal fires, hearts and minds, looking at that as an international strategic focus for humanitarian intervention. Objective, reducing suffering as a result of civil war, humanitarian crisis, crimes of genocide. The goal of the initiative was minimization of suffering civilian in accordance to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I am a member of the War Crimes Committee, the International Bar Association, tied in with the Human Rights Institute. That umbrella, the IBA membership represents 80,000 individual lawyers from most of the world's top law firms, 190 bar associations, law societies, spanning 170 countries. One of the most important focus areas of that effort is called responsibility to protect. And it's an umbrella that was set up to preventing genocide and mass atrocities. And the key theme of that focus is that sovereignty no longer exclusively protects states from foreign interference. It's a charge of responsibility that holds states accountable for the welfare of their people. Prevention requires apportioning responsibility to and promoting collaboration between concerned states and the international community. So when atrocities are occurring, war crimes, crimes against humanity, we have a legal mechanism to intervene. And that's a very, very important theme. IDIN, the International Disaster Information Network, was set up, as I had shared with you in the last segment, between me and the Federal Emergency Management Agency when we were preparing for Y2K to set up remediation. It was a 193 country network with governmental leaders, UN NGO, relief organization, corporate CIO, emergency management, media, interfaith community, and it was all a bridge into that level focus. So these are some of the tools that we were building on with this whole humanitarian intervention initiative. First major challenge that I entered into from a defense realm was in Iran in 2009. We had the youth uprising, and we're upwards of 1 million youth. 70% of the Iranian population is under 35. They were rallying on the streets of Tehran. There was a young lady killed named Nada Sultan. And when that happened, we had that footage on YouTube, and I opened it to the international media in that stream as a focus point as to the atrocities that were occurring in Tehran, and also developed the human rights reporting, evidence collection, witness protection guidelines, so that that information could reach the grassroots level. We could establish a vehicle that will allow individuals that are pulling together admissible evidence to have a protective umbrella and to channel that information into the right hands for an appropriate response, UN and the UN Security Council. With regards to the Iranian protests, despite our support of the youth movement, the Iranian government cracked down on those protests with brutal force, imprisoned, killed responsible. Despite our widespread appeals to the leaders in every UN member country, General Assembly, the bar associations, the international community failed to protect the youth and support the rule of international humanitarian human rights law. Today, the leadership in Iran responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity in 2009 are providing the military and strategic guidance for the leadership in Syria. That's an entire focus. We tried to pull the arts community because the Humanitarian Intervention Initiative was a United Nations Arts Initiative focus. The only support we got from them was Bon Jovi and Andy Madadian, who was an Iranian pop star, pulling together and doing a music video, Stand By Me. They got 8 million hits plus, but we still weren't able to accomplish too much with regards of the atrocities and protecting the populations. 2010 was when I shared with you that I cut the American Way soundtrack, and that was when I was going through a physical dilemma that ties in with some of the stress that was experienced over that 20-year period, and so that then took in and set us into 2012, the Benghazi attack.
Can you just hang on a second? I've got a slight technical, right? Everyone, I think that's our technical little glitch sorted out. Sorry to interrupt you there, Stephen. Can you continue?
Sure. In 2012, we had the Benghazi attack. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon condemned it. There was unanimous support by the UN Security Council for intervention, but we had no coordinated stabilization, security, transition, and reconstruction strategy. And that was crucial to address the challenges that were presented by the militias, the rogue states, transnational terrorists, and crime groups that were embedded in that country. It was a strategic failure. Yeah. Right around that same time period, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative provided a platform, and a fellow named Tim Crockett, who was a former Royal Marine, leading a security team for CNN that was filming 72 Hours Under Fire, contacted me, and he essentially gave me an overview of what was happening on the ground. As I share with you, Maria Colvin and Remy Olchek accompanied that CNN team, then exited into Lebanon, but went back in because the atrocities were so bad. They were targeted in a missile attack shortly after that and killed. Syria was a major problem. And my number one priority tied in to the weapons of mass destruction and preventing Iranian Hezbollah Hamas access to one of the world's largest stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons in Syria. That included Saddam's WMD stockpiles that were transferred just before the Iraqi operations in 2003.
Yeah, I think I'm going to jump in there. I don't think many people are actually aware that the days and hours before the second Iraq war, a lot of trucks were seen, and a lot of us were on the ground in OPs on the border at the time between Syria and Iraq. A lot of trucks were moved. A lot of equipment was moved. We're not saying it was just all full of the mysterious WMD that wasn't there. What we are saying is battlefield chemical weapons were moved from Iraq into Syria. And now there's evidence to support that. And there is also FBI documents that have been released that support what I've just said there as well. Okay, Stephen, can you continue, please?
Beyond the chemical weapons, the Syrian bioweapons program was a critical focus, especially when we talk about those transnational terrorist and crime groups. And that included anthrax, plague, tularemia, botulinum, smallpox, aflatoxin, cholera, ricin, camelpox. This was identified through the NATO Defense Establishment, biowarfare, and counterterrorism. And that was really the threat metric that the international community needed to contain so that it didn't take and flow into those transnational terrorist and crime networks nationwide, internationally. And it was also a major serious concern for the Israelis and other countries in the region. Luckily, after that background discussion started, it was a matter of hours before the Israelis had coordinated a targeted missile strike on their bioweapons facility. But that was an example of how one critical discussion regarding to a threat metric that could kill every man, woman, and child in a region could be responded if it's communicated effectively. The humanitarian catastrophe in Syria was compared to the Holocaust by Ban Ki-moon. We could not establish traction in the Security Council. Russia and China used their veto power. Russia was focused on protecting its naval base in Tartus, established joint military command with both states sponsored of terrorism, Iran and Assad. Our question, what happens when there's no vehicle to enforce an international security apparatus because the perpetrator of the war crimes and crimes against humanity is a P5 voting member of the UN Security Council, as in joint military command with the state sponsors of terrorism, Iran and Syria. So key humanitarian catastrophe. Today we have over 1 million mass graves, victims of chemical weapons attacks against civilians, war crimes, crimes against humanity, including brutalization, torture, rape of women and children. It went on long enough that the compilation of UN torture report on children came out, and there was no response by the international community. The floods of refugees into Turkey, today 3.5 million, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, mass migration of populations into Greece, into European Union. The biggest problem and aspect of this Syrian dilemma is that, in essence, the United States funded the atrocities. And I say that from a standpoint that the policy objectives of the nuclear agreement in Iran encompassed ignoring many of these challenges that were occurring, including the human rights abuses and the atrocities. And we had $1.7 billion of cash paid to the state sponsor of terrorism, Iran, and providing a direct funding for the Syrian operations and the terrorist operations worldwide were connected with Hezbollah.
I'm just going to jump in there because some of my viewers won't be aware of this. That is public. It's on public record that a very large shipment of, well, 3 large shipments in total went from America to Baghdad, from Baghdad International Airport to Lebanon. and it was then put in trucks with Hezbollah, and it was put in underground facilities in Lebanon run by Hezbollah. Then it was broken down and it went throughout the Hezbollah network. That was during the Obama administration. There is FBI documents released to confirm all this. They are on the internet, easy to find, but not many people realize that they're there, okay? So when Stephen says American money was used to broker a deal, it was. This was the same time that Project Cassandra was closed down by the Obama administration. That was a joint special operations and DEA task force in Lebanon. Then no action was taken against the Hezbollah criminal organization or the terrorist organization for many years. They were left alone because the Obama administration wanted the peace deal with Iran, or peace deal, the nuclear deal, which is now falling apart. And the West has now got the problem that the Hezbollah organization for the past 8 to 10 years has been left alone. They have grown into a massive multinational criminal empire and terrorist empire, which are now known to be heavily connected into Al-Qaeda and the Akani network as well. I just wanted to explain that a little bit. That is very brief overview. Stephen, can you continue, please?
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. The lack of international security to protect populations in Syria provided a green light for other geopolitical advances. And that included the Russian invasion, occupation, and annexation of Crimea. And that was significant because Ukraine has been a focused discussion in the media, but we ignored the protections that were provided to Ukraine for turning over their nuclear weapons, and that were outlined in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. And so all of these other discussions that relate to business deals and any issue that is outside of our responsibility to that treaty are simply misplaced. Another set of important events that took place in Syria is that Assad released terrorists from the prisons, including the 7/7 bombing mastermind, and facilitated a union with Saddam's former Ba'athist leaders and troops to help establish what evolved into ISIS.
Yeah.
The landscape from the 2008 to 2016 period left the planet Earth in a humanitarian security emergency. We had over 130 countries classified failed, failing, or fragile states. We had foreign fighters from over 120 countries travel into Syria to train at terrorist training camps, and then return to their home countries as sleeper cells.
Yeah.
Those capabilities of the sleeper cells included home production facilities for chemical weapons. In October, in Iraq 2013, Iraq smashed an Al-Qaeda poison gas cell working to produce both mustard gas and sarin at 2 locations for future attacks at home and abroad.
Yeah.
That was 2013. It's really nice to take and focus on access to precursor chemicals, but we need to understand that when we allow foreign fighters to come in and get WMD training and production training for home production, we have a real problem.
Yeah. There's definitely issues there. Absolutely. We could speak for hours on just a couple of those issues. What I'm going to lead you back to, if we can backtrack slightly, is the challenges on the ground and the dilemma. A lot of the operators or members of the armed forces are on the ground, both in Syria and Iraq now. Can you give us a brief overview of that, please?
I think what's critical in the context of this discussion is stems back to operations that were taking place and led by a Green Beret named Scott Mann in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And he was coordinating village stability operations, which were essentially stabilizing and securing the village level, providing training so that the villages had the capacity to protect themselves, and reestablish and develop the infrastructure and capacity for self-sustenance. And those operations were extremely successful, and that model applied to Iraq also was extremely important. And the whole concept of having a human rights focused objective that relates to your overall operational framework is a vitally important piece of the equation for your troops that are operating on the ground. And one of the challenges that Scott had was when there were policy decisions to pull out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the operations that the Green Berets were putting forward that spread like fire, village to village, created fear in the Taliban because they were so effective.
Yeah.
And it encompassed a landscape where you were empowering the village level to take care of itself. And then you, as a defense metric, were a support system, which could take and extract itself without having to be in full control of that security metric. So it gave you an actual stabilization and security metric for the entire country in proportion to how well you accomplish that in the village levels. One of the dilemmas that Scott had was when cut and run was announced and he needed to pull his forces out, he had no pathway to communicate the reports on the success of those operations through his chain of command so that there can be an appropriate operational framework developed that didn't destroy all of that progress. It didn't happen, and it was impossible. And essentially the Taliban went back into those villages, killed those leaders and the male component, and left us with a catastrophe that is almost impossible to contemplate how trust and confidence would ever be obtained again in those villages. So this whole inability to communicate human rights abuses and efforts to protect under that responsibility to protect umbrella and how that ties in with operations is a vitally important piece of this equation.
Yeah, for people to understand this, I'm going to put it in very layman's terms. Human intelligence assets from Scott Mann and the team were on the ground. Incredible work, massively successful across Afghanistan. Not even a question about that. Cut and run, cut and dry. Had to pull everyone out. The Taliban came in literally within a month or so and destroyed years of work. Literally, they just walked into villages and executed any fighting male of age and the heads of all the villages, all the sheikhs. So years of hard work, winning people's trust at village grassroots level, which that that trust led to a lot of attacks being stopped, a lot of information passed on to coalition forces, lives saved. All that was undone within a month. End of. I was on the ground when a lot of that happened, and it was heartbreaking to actually see. Now, the problem we've got is, how can trust be rebuilt again? This was not the military guys on the ground. They were heartbroken when this happened because they knew what was gonna happen. I know a lot of American officers who left the service after this. A very similar thing happened, Project Cassandra, when politicians got involved, made decisions that had absolute deadly effects on the ground for human intelligence and human assets. Project Cassandra, assets were abandoned on the ground. They then were tracked by terrorist groups and they were executed. End of. If anyone's got a problem about wanting to query that, come and see me. I have evidence of that. Yes, so the human intelligence side of things, in your opinion, Stephen, because you are very experienced in dealing with a lot of this, and you are a bridge from the ground grassroots, from people like myself and other networks, to agencies which include Defense Department, CIA, FBI, government agencies, and American Central Command as well. So you are very connected. In your opinion, how can the damage be repaired? Can it be?
Those are extremely complicated questions
Yeah, I know.
that are as deep as people that specialize in trauma therapy embrace after catastrophic incidents. You're talking about coming to terms with an entire trust equation of a failure, that there is no evidence that if trust was given again, that the same thing wouldn't happen to them. So, you know, this is a dilemma that not only takes place on that village level, it takes place with countries that are ignored when they're the victims of circumstance because atrocities are allowed in other countries. You know, it spirals on many, many different levels. My view is that the whole concept of humanitarian operations, caring for populations, substance on the ground, will bring you more progress in relation to those human connections than anything. They really are the most important piece of the equation. And then we have to have substance behind what we say and what we do, and a mechanism to defend in the event that there's a reversal that causes harm and breaks promises that we made. So, yeah, vitally important.
I know that's a very difficult thing to actually answer. You actually can't. All what I'll say on that one is trust can be rebuilt. The military guys on the ground and these PSYOPs people were incredible. What they achieved, people like Scott Mann, was unbelievable. The amount of positivity that was there. But politicians, again, make decisions detached from what the reality is on the ground. They were most probably advised by their advisors, political advisors, that not many people will be killed. They got that wrong. It caused havoc. To rebuild now the human in and the trust in places like Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan is going to take a lot of work. It can be done, but they need to listen to people in power like yourself, Stephen, as well, and listen to people who are grassroots in the villages. Some of the special operators that are out in places in the Middle East at the moment on the ground, they're able to see things. They need to get it in reports, feed it up the chain as well. Then obviously then the healing process can start. There is some very good people in the Middle East at village level that still want to help us as well, because they're caught in the middle of this. You've got the bad guys, you've got a lot of Western influence, and you've got some local people who are caught in the center of it. And if people are going to put their trust in Western countries again, Western countries cannot betray that trust, because when you do, it leads to people being executed. It ain't good, okay? So my message to any politicians watching that, seek advice. Don't do knee-jerk reactions. An example, the Kurds, the Kurdish people, they are our allies, they're our friends, they helped us. ISIS would not have been defeated without the Kurdish government, KRG, and the people of Kurdistan. So let's show a little bit of respect and help them now, okay? I'm slightly biased. I have a lot of Kurdish friends, but they're our friends. And remember, we don't want ISIS to come back or morph into something else, which is happening now, which we will talk on a later interview, okay? Now, on Stephen, with your experience with the biggest challenges moving forward now in being able to get advisors the right information, these are the guys who make the policies. These are the guys who send our troops in on the ground. Reference the flow of information, communication, human intelligence, human rights abuse is being reported. Do you feel there should be a better chain of command and Egypt has passed that information up to senior people? Can you explain this one, please?
I think that the concept of village stability operations needs to become a doctrinal focus for foreign internal defense across board, meaning that to have a civil affairs component integrated into every combat command and every operational focus is vitally important. And it encompasses the needs of the people on the grassroots level, and not only a short-term strategic objective, but also the long-term objective of how that operation ties in to a stabilization, security, transition, reconstruction metric, so that we can pull countries from the village level out of these failing, fragile state scenarios. And instead of taking and running band-aids in countries for damage control and crisis response, stabilizing them out and serving as a support bridge for international security. And I believe that the doctrine is critically important. The standards and objective to support that doctrine are important. The information on the ground from a standpoint of threat assessment is vitally important. How the information flows in relation to any scenarios that contradict the objectives of the operations that are supported by a doctrinal framework are vitally important. And this is critical within the ranks of active duty and also the private military security contract component, that in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan during the Obama administration had encompassed upwards of 2/3 of all the forces on the ground. We may have pulled active duty in order to lower numbers, but we took and flooded the countries with private military contractors, and they are not given the same amount of type of recognition as the active duty component, nor is there trauma or their PTSD or loss of life or suicide, traumatic events, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's a very important point. The amount of people, ex-military guys, men and women, who are part of PMCs, private military contractors, in the Middle East, across the Middle East and Africa. There is a lot of guys out there. Do you think, because the PMC element is such a big, unexperienced element in every war zone in the world, do you think there should be a stronger bridge between the PMCs, the United Nations, Central Command, and SOCOM as well? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, to the extent that they are embedded in operations, they are a functional component part of the active duty operational environment.
Well,
so
yeah, I find it very, I've not seen it very often that PMCs actually write full reports and fire them up the chain on humanitarian issues, specifically, not on about combat issues or being in a firefight, IED. That's just basic skills. Reports are written, passed up the chain. When they come across humanitarian issues, write the report out, get it up the chain to the military. Because at one point there was more PMCs operating in one Middle East country than what there was in American soldiers. So I think that speaks volumes. People have got an entity on the ground that could be used to feed information back. I'm not just talking about intelligence, because that should happen anyway. I'm on about humanitarian to stop issues on the ground. I think that's an important thing moving forward of one of the challenges. If we have an element of thousands of men on the ground, ex-military with enough experience to know when something's wrong, bang it into a report, get it up the chain. I think the military commanders of these countries, especially from an American point of view, you've got SOCOM and CENTCOM, get information up to them. They can analyze it, feed it back down to agencies, even maybe the United Nations. It's just, if you've got an asset on the ground of so many men, you've got to utilize it. Right, we're going to come to an end in a couple of minutes of this part 2 interview. Is there any message, Stephen, that you would like to pass on to any veterans out there that are going through a hard time at the moment?
I'd like to take a time to address the issue that you had just brought up in relation to the information flow. The International Network and the Global Special Operations Network around 2010. And so that is a HRI, H2 OPSEC bridge to the intelligence, defense, Interpol, LEO, fusion operational level worldwide. Yeah. So there is a chain that can be tapped in relation to that information flow when it's needs to take and expand or support the defense umbrella. Discussing these issues is vitally important. Conflict resolution is many times a part of how do we cope with the atrocities that we had watched, because we didn't have a vehicle to protect those populations, which may be one of the views in our minds as to why we're even there. And so we need to really address the war crimes, crimes against humanity issues in our watch, and how they occur, and what steps need to take place to protect, and to deal with the trauma that individuals and those forces have from experiencing those atrocities themselves, as a trauma therapy focus for PTSD.
Right. Stephen, I'm going to jump in there now because I think we should have a very quick break before we continue. And everyone will be back in a couple of minutes' time. Thank you for watching. Welcome back, everyone. After that very short break, we are going to jump straight back in with Stephen again, and we're going to be speaking about Afghanistan and how 90% of the world's opium comes from Afghanistan. Stephen, please take over.
Yeah, Anthony, the last part of the cut and run discussion with regards to Afghanistan and how forces are being organized brings into question the significance of, despite the operations that have taken place over the last 20 years, that 90% of the world's opium supply is still able to free flow from Afghanistan. And one thing that you mentioned with regards to your operations in Pulachari prison was how the overdose epidemic was actually a strategic plan by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
And the interrelationship of the Hezbollah, transnational crime networks, the flow of the opium worldwide, but especially into the United States, is of vital importance.
Yeah.
If we look at the opium crisis in the context of 9/11, we have 3,000 people that died on 9/11/2001. We have 10,000 more people that died from hazmat exposures from the incident site because it wasn't evacuated, from cancer, that continue to die. But still, that's a metric of around 15,000 people. And with regards to the opium and the opioid epidemic, in 2017, we had 70,000 deaths from opioid overdoses in the United States.
Yep.
Overwhelming the first responder level, police, fire, EMS, grassroots level across the United States. And I say this from a standpoint of that one opium supply variable to an actual grassroots incursion and impact as a terrorist attack component. It brings us into Latin America. and the gateway into the United States. And the tie-in of Iran, Hezbollah, and the Russian Joint Military Command component. That free flow of opioids through the cartels and Hezbollah embedded in the cartels, it encompasses a challenge operationally in at least 1,286 US cities. The significance of the US border security catastrophe to the Middle East and the European Union is that as countries collapse, the migrant populations move to safe havens. And we discuss how that encompassed Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq, but also the European Union. In Latin America, those populations in failing and fragile states migrate to the United States as a safe haven. We have a North American, United States specific national security challenge where states are involved in the exploitation of Latin American countries on many, many different levels. And that includes the impact directly into the United States, as mentioned with the cartels. And the 70,000 a year that are dying from opioid overdoses is one piece of the equation. The way that I look at presenting the WMD transfer threat in the United States is that every counterfeit good, drug, human trafficking, arms that enters the United States without detection has the capacity to be a WMD. And when we are looking at that threat metric, it's vitally important to look at these pieces because obviously we have a free flow of goods, illicit goods, through transnational crime networks. And it's only been by luck that we have avoided a WMD 9/11 because of these holes that are so big.
Yeah, it is a very worrying factor of the criminal element in Central America with Hezbollah as well and the Iraqi network being able to funnel so much opium straight into the United States. We have a similar problem in Europe and the United Kingdom as well. I was privy to some meetings with the Iraqi network. I sat in the meetings with Salahuddin and Mutawakil and 3 other senior commanders, regional commanders, not just of Afghanistan, outside of Afghanistan. And they were using the drugs as a weapon against the West. End of. They were freely wanting to pump it as much as they could into Europe and the United States, and the damage it was doing to our countries, European countries and America, and the actual strain that was going to put, the more addicts, it's going to drain parts of the resources and the economy. Just how bad a problem is this in America now?
Like I said, we're looking at the 70,000 opioid deaths number a year. And the next focus I was going to go into was 2020 and the entire spiral that is tied in with COVID and social services and addiction support just spirals this whole crisis to another level.
Yeah, I think we've actually seen a massive spiral in Europe, in the United Kingdom, even though it's not being reported on. it's spiraled, and the addiction and the uses of heroin in particular are very high now. They have peaked across the board. And there's a lot of official statistics to back that up as well. All this boils down to criminal organizations and terrorist organizations working together, and they're using the opium and narcotics as literally a weapon against the West. In a lot of cases that I've witnessed in Europe, I've seen terrorist organizations using the criminal elements and making the drugs so cheap as well. The prices of the narcotics have come down severely. And that is a worrying factor. Normally, criminal enterprises are money driven. A lot of these terrorist groups are now overtaking the criminal enterprises in the distribution of narcotics, and they're giving them away, for want of a better word to it. That is a very worrying spiral that we are starting to see now. Obviously with Colombia as well, the cocaine there as well, but we're just going to focus on the Afghan side of things at the moment, given the fact of the war on terror has been going on for quite some time now, 20 odd years, and the narcotics are still at 90% in Afghanistan. So the question has to be asked, why are they still so high, given the fact there is a war still going on there? There's a very fragile peace agreement signed by Salahuddin himself, head over the Khani network, and obviously signed on behalf of the Taliban. But that is a very fragile peace deal. Some would say it doesn't even stand up now because of everything else that has been happening. So what's your thoughts on this, Stephen? Why do we still have Afghanistan producing 90% of the world's opium?
Those are complicated questions that go as deep as, again, the village levels, the inability to stabilize and secure, as well as provide alternative means for survival economically. You know that that variable has to be overcome through a viable alternative that makes sense on those levels. So if you can address that, then you have a huge gap to exploit.
There is, yeah. Obviously, without one, very, very complex, not a straightforward answer. It's going to be a combination of an awful lot to try and stabilize before we even try to drop the percentages down. The routes, some of my viewers will be very interested in the routes used by, or the rat lines used by the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Khani network from Afghanistan through Iran, through Iraq, Turkey, Syria, into Lebanon, the Mediterranean ports, into Europe, obviously. But a lot of people won't realize a lot of these drugs are then shipped over by ship, literally, to Central America. Can you speak a little bit about this?
My exploration of these topics have really been focused on the extent that Iran and Hezbollah has integrated itself into the cartels, and the extent that they are working jointly to accomplish those transfers. And those are the issues that the DEA special security teams were working on, as you mentioned, with the Project Cassandra initiative. And those are the reports that we need released and dissected in order to look at the intricacies operationally.
Yeah, I think a lot of some of Project Cassandra's documents have been released. They are on public file now. The FBI were the people who released them, but not a lot of them. A lot of it is still very sensitive. The fact of a lot of my viewers won't be aware that the Colombian drug cartels heavily involved in helping Hezbollah, helping the Akani network, transport, protect, and distribute a lot of drugs. So this isn't just hearsay, there's facts there. A lot of evidence to support this. Terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, with their criminal arm as well, have been using the narcotics to fund international terrorism by transporting it into Central America. Heroin goes one way, cocaine comes back as well. There is evidence of this as well. So a lot of people won't realize that. So Hezbollah being a criminal organization as well as a terrorist one, that's a big light now that the FBI and the DEA are being able to shine on that, with all roads leading back to Iran. Don't forget, Hezbollah, criminal organization, but the terrorist branch are operating in Afghanistan and Iraq, and are responsible for the deaths, direct action deaths of British and American and coalition forces over there. A lot of the drug money is being used to help build, run, and make factory-shaped charges, which are being made in factories in Iran, transported overland by terrorist groups, and used in Afghanistan and Iraq again. Direct action, this has led to the deaths of British and American troops. I know no one wants to really speak about a lot of this, but it's out there. It's public knowledge. We're not breaking any OPSEC or anything. It's out there, released in documents. FBI have released these documents. Put it into the internet, have a read of it. I think it's very interesting. My viewers are now going to see that all the spectrum of international terrorism is helped to be funded by organized crime within their own networks. Even the Akani network, it's a terrorist organization. It has an organized crime arm of it as well. Al-Qaeda, no one wishes really to speak about that. Yeah, terrorist organization, organized crime as well. It's there. They all have the element there. Now, the problem the West has got, Europe, obviously Great Britain, and the United States and Canada, is these organized crime and terrorist organizations are now working together as one. That is a worrying factor, not just because narcotics makes a lot of money, so they've got an endless stream to fund international terrorism. These organizations are also trading and exchanging intelligence. The rat runs are being used across countries, the safe houses, not just for transporting terrorists or high-value targets or narcotics. One of the things that we investigated in Afghanistan and we found evidence of, and it was reported up the chain, was human organ smuggling. Very big market for that. The British Embassy in Kabul was fully aware back in 2007 and 8 up to 2010 that children who were alive were being used for human organs brought into Iran, into Turkey. That is where their journey ended, for want of a better word. I'm not going to go into much detail about that, but the rat runs that we used are the same rat runs used for narcotics. So if you close one down, you can close multiple things coming through that. I think the roots actually are key to an awful lot to do with the narcotics. So say if Project Cassandra under a different name was enabled again, which I've heard part of it now is, then at least the war on terror, the war on drugs, people trafficking, human organs with children, surface missiles, those sort of things, and chemical weapons. Focus should be on closing down the rat lines, safe houses, then the networks. Cut off, and if you choke off their supply chain, narcotics is how they finance everything. That could be, that's my opinion. No one else, just my opinion. That would work to weaken the terrorist organizations. That's my opinion from being inside some of these terrorist organizations and seeing how they operate as well. In your opinion, reference Central America and the cartels helping, for want of a better word, terrorist organizations. What's your thoughts on that? What is the solution to that?
I think that this is an excellent point to bridge into another integrated piece of this equation, and that's that we have direct relationships with states, with the transnational terrorist and crime networks. So we have Russia, China, and Iran specifically involved in hybrid unconventional warfare. So we have geopolitical objectives being pursued through hybrid unconventional warfare that includes the use and the exploitation of these other transnational terrorist and crime networks and pieces. That has been a major focus of mine over the last 10 years. It's tied directly into the spirals that we've watched, especially in 2020, in the United States and in the European Union. And it's a vitally important piece which is not embraced with the extent of the operational integrity that has actually overwhelmed functional parts of society. And I'd like to use that as an opportunity to bridge into 2020 and the role that these hybrid operations have had specifically in the United States. Lara Logan is a war correspondent, investigative journalist. You might remember her as the journalist that was brutally attacked at Tahrir Square in February 2011. She noted an article and a quote. The article was in RT. It was entitled "Election War Games: A New America Waits in the Wings After Pre-Planned Chaos." And her note was that the last line of Webb's article states, "By keeping Americans angry and distracted by partisan divide through pre-planned election chaos, a new America waits in the wings, one that's coming regardless of what happens on election day. That is, of course, unless Americans quickly wake up to the ruse." Well, this is all tied together in an intricate way. The Global Special Operations Network, and I've been directly involved in pieces of this equation over 2020. And we had the start of the COVID-19 challenge, and looking at the information operations and unconventional warfare side of destabilizing not only the United States, but NATO ally countries. And this was a major challenge because I was working in the biodefense spheres in the early 2000s with SARS-1. And my core insider group were the top biodefense experts in the United States. And when COVID began, the discussions began, I immediately looked at poor and impoverished countries to see the impact of how the pathogen spreading within those borders was impacting those populations. And we didn't see an impact. So it was a very, very interesting focus that it seemed like the only countries that were being devastated were G20 countries, not countries without clean water and food and access to medicine, which we would normally see a catastrophic spiral. And that COVID had started an entire series of actions that had actually been exploited by states, by Russia, China, and Iran progressively. And when we had the George Floyd death in Minnesota, we saw a progression that was very similar to Ferguson years earlier, where we had actually Russia involved not only in the information operations side of amplification of the crisis, but had operatives functioning in US territory to bring about riots and events that were then televised on their large screens in their major cities, as well as in China, to bring across a propaganda-based message. And so we had a similar situation with the George Floyd riots and across the United States, and in the integration of anti-government groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter, which have a deeper underlying foundational element as to how they're tied in with these events. We had wildfires across the United States, and we had an arson focus of 1,360 fires at one point raging. Well, one piece of this equation that we didn't quite recognize back from a few years earlier was that Inspire magazine and Al-Qaeda was providing direct guidelines as to how to use wildfires as a terrorist attack element targeting the United States. Then we have the entire progression of the election that we won't go into a lot of details on, but the Capitol terrorist attack or the Capitol riot and that entire event is another whole deep focus that has brought us back to Antifa. And now we have just reported today evidence that the news networks were purchasing footage from specific Antifa activists that were involved in that entire episode. We're tying that into that there was a specific rejection of 10,000 National Guard troops to protect the Capitol, which points to actually the challenges at the Capitol that day being orchestrated and planned with a specific destructive objective, rather than just playing out as a simple incitement focus. Again, that goes into an entire political discussion that we don't want to touch. Yeah. But what's vital here is that we have the anti-government groups that are now the focus in the United States of the Mandalay Bay mass shooting, the George Floyd riots, 140 cities, the most destructive in US history, tied into the Nashville bombing, raid on the Capitol, bombs placed in the DNC, RNC throughout Washington, D.C. And we have a spiral that is very intensive. It's tied in to the hybrid unconventional warfare integrated state-sponsored pieces. And these aspects are operational not only in the United States, but throughout the European Union and all 28 NATO ally countries.
Yeah.
So right now, we're taking that spiral over 2020 and looking at them from a NATO collective defense crisis standpoint and bringing village stability operations from the grassroots level in Afghanistan to US cities, because right now these spirals have caused a mental health emergency, a public health emergency, an educational system child development crisis because the educational system was shut down, small business and corporate operations emergency, interfaith support emergency. So what we have is a situation from a standpoint of village stability operations that ties back into my work in the early 90s. Yeah. And when I had worked in hundreds of US cities, our focus in those cities was becoming a voice for the executive directors of the frontline programs that were working with the crisis issues and providing them a platform to articulate the unmet needs. And those unmet needs overviews are critical for your strategic planning and development of your solution-oriented approaches. And that is something that we're striving to set forth in the United States on the grassroots city county level and trying to get embraced within the NATO ally countries themselves with the same type of objective, to think through a strategic planning focus that encompasses these different variables that have been extremely destructive during this time period, directly relating to state-sponsored hybrid unconventional warfare operations. So to tie together that piece, how it relates with the transnational terrorist crime networks, is something that I was hoping to pull together at the end of this entire discussion, because it encompasses all those that were affected by the addiction pieces, all of our support for our veterans, all of these challenges. They're the unmet needs landscape. Those are issues that have been intensified and magnified in scope that need to be discussed and with strategic planning, with substance, in order to address the scope of those problems.
Exactly. I think we're definitely going to have to get you back on the show again. There is so much more, and my email is been pinging a little bit. So I have a feeling I'm going to have to send you quite a lot of questions. People are wanting a little bit more information on some of the subjects, obviously, that we're speaking about. We will have another full episode which will be dealing with some of the things that you've just spoken about there as well. Very important. The veteran affairs, obviously, that is of paramount importance to myself and obviously you and our viewers. And the transnational, all the connections between how the terrorist networks are interconnected, how they operate. Well, that is quite an in-depth interview as well. And I think people will find that very interesting as well, how everything is interconnected, who's working with who and who is helping who as well. Not very many people realize how it all is interconnected. But I said that is another full hour episode and a very detailed account that we will put together for my viewers as well. All right, Stephen, on that bombshell, thank you so much for coming back on the show again. You're a good friend of mine anyway, and I know you are very experienced. So when you're talking, you're not talking out of a textbook. You're talking from actually being there. You've seen it. A bit like myself. I'm not great at reading out of a textbook, but I am very good about being on the ground across Middle East countries in Africa. I photographed an awful lot. I logged it all, and I kept a detailed diary of every day I was in the Middle East and Africa. So that's how much information we were able to keep, which now helps the United Nations and other agencies with a lot of their work as well. Right, so I would like to say again, thank you, Stephen. As always, absolute pleasure. It's been emotional. I think my viewers would have gained a big insight into a lot of things on that one. Any questions, please PM me and I will feed them back to Stephen. Would you like to say anything else, Steve?
Just thank you, Anthony. You're doing excellent work. These discussions and the objective to bridge the gaps in the field in relation to events that could be embraced from a rapid response standpoint, just with the flow of information, is critical for national security from a collective defense standpoint for the alliance, and it's cutting edge. So appreciate the hard work you're doing, and look forward to supporting this.
Okay, Steve. Well, on that one, can you hold on the line for a couple of minutes, please? And we'll have a chat off camera. I'd like to say thank you for everyone for watching the Patriot Show. Have a nice evening. Stay safe and enjoy. Speak to you on the next show. Thank you very much.